All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome. Y'all ready for some fun FUN? We're going to be covering the heretic Dyer, and we're going to refute him and all the stupid things he used to believe. Wow, what a goofus. What a goober. Can you believe this guy? He believes so many wrong things, and he is going to get totally debunked today by his alternate personality, Dyer. So I sketched out my top 10 errors and mistakes that I think I want to try to caution against, the mistakes I believed. But I'm also going to steel man myself and help understand the best arguments for the positions that I used to have. And they're not all theological. In fact, we're going to be touching on a lot of practical things, practical mistakes that I made when I was younger. Hopefully then we can avoid some of those same mistakes. We debated all the big names, all the big boys, and we pantsed them all. We removed the big boy pants from all the big boys. So the last enemy is ourselves. We've discovered the enemy, and the enemy is us. But I feel energized, and I'm ready to refute myself. Some of this comes, I think, with immaturity and where I was in my 20s. So hopefully we can hit on that, and you guys will be spared from the mistakes that I made. A lot of people think, oh, he's mean. He's so mean. I'm not mean. I just have allergies. And that's my free pass. I am disabled. I'm a minority with allergies. I'm oppressed by the pollens. Pollen boy oppresses me. And as a minority status, I'm basically excused in anything I've ever done. As a younger idealistic man, and I was very idealistic, the first thing that comes to mind is, and this is not all bad, so we're going to be charitably nuanced throughout this discussion. Most young men are very idealistic, and so they are convinced that when they discover true things, when they get a piece of the picture, that's the whole picture. That's the answer for everything, for all society. And you see it on the left and on the right. So you're a 20-year-old dude. You just discovered orthodoxy. You just discovered the flaws in the wartime consensus. You discovered the flaws in the propaganda that we've been sold. You discovered that feminism is not true. And so what's the next logical result? The opposite extreme, and enforcing this new view everywhere with an iron fist. In fact, liberalism is the opposite of the worship of authority. Therefore, we need to bring back authority. We need a strong man to look to. We need a man of history that Spengler and Yaki and Evola talk about. If you go the leftist route as a young person, you probably think, I'm going to be an artist, bro, and I'm going to change the world with my communist socialist policies and ideas. I'm going to use my art to free the minds of all the prisoners. And if you go the right-wing route, you're going to be the beige trad cat who's going to erect the medieval scholastic empire of Thomistic disputations and Spanish Inquisitional kings. I'm joking. We're going to have the return of, wait a minute, Isabella. Well, she's a woman, so we can't have the return of a queen. We're going to have the return of, who's the ultimate trad cat king? King St. Louis. But then what happens is, as you study that stuff and you study history and you study geopolitics, you start to learn other things about the real world and how far afield the medieval world is from today. And you start to wonder, is it really plausible that we could erect a come and gone historical form? Can we recreate? Can we bring back the 1940s? Can we bring back Byzantium? Can we bring back a medieval Templar kingdom? And when you're young and idealistic, you think, yes, all I got to do is go on an ideological Twitter crusade. And if I convince enough people, we can change the system. This is really just the right-wing version of what Marxists and socialists tapped into with Maoism, for example. Mao understood that he could tap into the communist youth, radicalize them because they're ignorant and immature, and they don't really have enough life experience yet to understand how the world really works, how difficult, nuanced, and challenging the world is, how there are factions of power groups, how there are gray areas in life, how there are things that sometimes there's not an easy black and white answer to. When you're 20 years old, there's an easy black and white answer to everything. And probably the worst time period is when you're in your late 20s, because the late 20s people think they have figured everything out. They're never wrong about anything. They've got it all figured out, and everybody is completely stupid but them. So probably 27, 28 is the worst time in your life for this lesson. However, when you get into your 30s, you started to realize, okay, wait a minute. A lot of my idealistic fervor and zeal that I had in my 1930s, in my 19s and my 20s, in my teens and 20s, wasn't really based in reality. It was based on a lot of good ideas that I thought, well, what if I could just kind of push this into the world? Think of Redeem Zoomer thinks he can reform Protestantism. I thought the same thing when I was his age. Did the exact same thing. I told you guys my funny story about writing out my own Protestant theses and taping them up on the church doors in my hometown. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem is not a lack of zeal. It's not even necessarily zeal without knowledge, because even though I was wrong about the Protestant stuff, you could conceivably be right about a lot of your geopolitical points. So you're a 20-year-old guy, you're out here memeing for Tiny Mustache Man, and oh yeah, we've been lied to in the West. Oh yeah, we have been, controlled and run and subverted by AIPAC and so forth. But maybe you don't have the whole picture. Maybe there's other factors and things that you're not aware of yet. And it's not even that you're bad. It's that you've only had enough time in life to be experienced, to experience a limited number of options. So there's things that you haven't even heard or encountered yet that are real possibilities for nuance and for distinction. And a lot of things that we think are ideal, or if you could just force all the women to wear burqas, this kind of stuff, it's not even addressing the main issue. The main issue isn't external. The main issue is, for most of us, actually starting with us. So the first lesson that I had to learn was that my idealism was not going to fix the world. And it's so wrong-headed to begin with, because why would the world listen to me when my own life isn't even right? Does that make sense? There's a lack of lived experience when it comes to the ideology of fixing the system by going back to some medieval ideal. For example, look at what we see with people like Wagner. Wagner is erecting a Thomistic, scholastic online cult that has nothing really to do with Rome, the actual Roman Catholic Church. Because Rome long ago quit caring about Thomism. You think Pope Leo cares about what Thomas Aquinas says in the Middle Ages? No. And so Wagner might have good motivations. Maybe he really thinks that medieval scholasticism is the answer, but much like Redeem Zoomer, it's not really realistic. It's not the real world. It's not where we are. It's not where his church hierarchy and leadership is. And so it's just kind of funny. And I guarantee you in 10 years, he'll look back at a lot of this and think how silly it was, thinking that you could restore the Middle Ages or bring back medieval scholasticism when it's already come and gone. So you see there's different versions of this, right? There's the left-wing socialist idea, oh, we're going to institute everybody getting a universal basic income and it'll all be fair and equal. That's not realistic. And it also it doesn't take into account not just the practical failures of communism and socialism, but it doesn't even take into account how socialism has been a tool of wealthy elites. So it's a very naive, unstudied, and unlived experience. And you'll notice that typically with a lot of the ideological figures, the face lords, they attract very young guys who are very idealistic. Now, it's not bad to be young and idealistic. It's just that you need time to mature. And there's no bypassing that. You can't make that happen with some kind of special argument or the right book or the right algorithm or the right disputation. It just takes lived experience. And it also takes lived experience of you making mistakes. So if you're 20, 25, you've not had enough time even to make mistakes yet. And you will make mistakes. You will make moral failures. You will have huge mistakes in your life that you're going to regret. I don't care who you are. There's nobody that gets out of life without some kind of big mistake or failure or something. And that will teach you the lesson that you're not better than everybody else. But 20-year-old guys think they've got it all figured out. They're better than everybody else. Everything's black and white. And by the time they're 30 and they cheat on their girlfriend or they've been cheated on or they fall into some error, they'll learn the lessons the hard way. This is why God allows us, as the saints say, to fall into these sins, is to teach us humility. And humility is more important than having the right scholastic disputation. It doesn't make scholastic disputations necessarily wrong. Many of the Orthodox saints were very scholastic, like St. Photius. But it's more important to be humble than it is to simply be right, but also understand that humility is not the same thing as being confident, humility is not the same thing as pretending to be soft-spoken and have a Skittles affectation and talking like an NPR person or appearing very pious and praying on the internet, praying on stream. Oh Lord, I pray to you that all of the internet debaters would humble themselves and be more like me. God, I thank you that I am not like these internet debater men who are so impious. And the 304s on OnlyFans, I am so much better, but I thank you, God, that you made me better than them. And I will pray online for all of you like Scam Shamu for 30 minutes. I mean, that's worse than the 304. So a lot of people mistake that kind of stuff for spirituality. I think it's a performative stage play or something. I don't know. That's not what it is. And ultimately, only God knows our hearts, even though, yes, it's true that you will know them by their fruits. So the first mistake, big error that I made when I was young was thinking in an overly idealistic way and not realizing that life isn't actually, in some areas it's black and white, but in a lot of things and in a lot of areas, it's not that easy in black and white. And you only learn that with age and maturity. The next thing that awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers was a couple books. And when I talk about Spengler, I'm not promoting him as like infallible or that he got everything right. In fact, I think he made some pretty significant kind of basic philosophical blunders. But when I read a good bit of Decline of the West, I was impressed with the way that Spengler categorized history, kind of similar to the way that the prophet Daniel categorizes history, right? In these kind of life cycles or organic forms that have a lifespan, a birth, a growth, a nadir, and a death. And when I read this, I realized, oh, actually, you don't ever bring back or reinstate a come and gone historical form. And this really crushed the overly idealistic attitude that I had that you could recreate, a medieval Latin Templar Knight kingdom or a Byzantine imperial, superstructure. It doesn't mean there can't be a return to traditional forms, to monarchy, to, out of Homo economicus. All those things are possible. It just means that you're not going to recreate a come and gone form. So I also read another text around the same time from somebody in a similar sort of school, and he's a controversial figure, and that is Francis Parker Yockey's Imperium. And both Spengler and Yockey's books were influential, but they both taught me and showed me that, again, historical forms come and go, and politics and empires come and go. So if empires come and go, then we need something beyond an empire that is actually the power in even an empire. And that, of course, is Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox Christianity was the actual power behind Byzantium. And when Orthodoxy faded, Byzantium became uniate and faded. When other ancient civilizations and their ideology faded, they didn't come back. There will be no new revived Chaldean Magus society. Like Spengler talks about Magian societies. Societies focus around the magus, right? The magician. There will be no new future Faustian society. In fact, Spengler predicted that the third world would utilize the technology that Faustian Western man created to then subjugate Western man. And he seems to have been accurate in that prediction because, as we know, Wellington House, the predecessor to Tavistock, studied Spengler's Decline of the West to weaponize it. Spengler was not against the West. He was talking about where he saw these forms going, these civilizations going. So studying civilizations and getting into civilizational studies, not just reading these men, but also reading, Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, reading Julius Evola, reading the Perennialists, reading a lot of these people over the years throughout my 20s and 30s showed me that a broader, wiser perspective, I think, understands that we can only go forward in the future building on the shoulders of giants, but never reinstating a come and gone historical form. And if you understand that, it's not absolutizing historical process. It's just recognizing the limitations of historical forms. And so I think Spengler would say something like, you could build on the shoulders of the giants that came before. You could build on the shoulders of the previous civilizations, but you will never resurrect Byzantium or the Holy Roman Empire or whatever your pet Dungeons and Dragons, dungeon lore is. And this is why it is accurate to understand Tradcatism and Third Way Reichism kind of as Dungeons and Dragons lore. It's LARPing for sure. Now, the next thing that happened, as I've talked about, my next big mistake that I was wrong about when I was younger, and we'll get into some of the theology here in a minute. I'm not going to spend too much time on steel manning Protestantism because I think everybody kind of knows why a person would be Protestant or even Roman Catholic. I will touch on those, but it's not going to be the focus of what we talk about today. But my next big mistake was conspiracies. Yes, you heard me right. Conspiracies. What? How could conspiracies be a mistake when haven't we been vindicated and seen that over the last 20 plus years of, let me see, I've been a conspiracy theorist since 1998. So 27 years of conspiracy theorists. How could that be, quote, wrong? How could that be debunked? And I think for everybody who gets into that kind of stuff, going down the rabbit hole and all that, you know, there's a kind of a process. You go through a phase of, oh, maybe aliens are real. Maybe there was ancient Atlantis civilizations with high technology. Maybe there is moon bases with, Galians running around touching. Who knows, right? You got to go through the phases. But after a while, you start to realize actually a lot of this is just complete bullcrap. And the people that push the nonsense are pretty much kind of con men and goofballs. And you start to realize after a while, these people are just making up nonsense. Remember the face on Mars? Remember Richard Hoagland? And I'm just using this as one example of, I remember when I first started reading a lot of this kind of conspiratorial stuff, and I read Hoagland's book, Dark Mission, was that the name of it? And then it's like, wait a minute. So there's all these bases on Mars, and NASA was some sort of alien. It's just a bunch of nonsense, right? Yeah, that's it. Dark Mission. And, like coast to coast level stuff, right? And then you start to realize, okay, wait a minute. This is all just distraction, science, sci-fi gibberish and nonsense, right? Because that stuff is almost a massive distraction from real conspiracies. Now, I'm not saying that there's no weird phenomena that go on. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that a lot of these people you start to realize are kooks, spooks, and crooks, and all of the above, right? You could be all three. So one of the things that shook me out of my dogmatic slumbers in this regard was a documentary I saw when it came out. Oh, what's the name? I just went blank. What's the documentary that shows the alien stuff? It's a bunch of psyops. It's a really good documentary. Mirage Man. Now, I'm not saying that everything in this documentary is true. I'm saying that this, combined with other critiques that the Collins brothers had written about the alien phenomena, they'd written articles like Alien Smokescreen 20 years ago, 20 years ago, way before they had collected it together in their excellent book, Invoking the Beyond. I started to think, well, wait a minute, a lot of this alien stuff just doesn't even make sense. And you start to notice that the alien narrative also pushes technocracy, it pushes panspermia, Darwinian evolution, a bunch of the stuff that we think is obvious gibberish is pushed by the alien loons. So if you've never seen this, I highly recommend it. And I'm just using alien stuff as one example. I was never actually really into aliens. I remember entertaining the possibility of this, maybe in the year 2003 or 4. But for me, aliens always just seem fake and gay. And you say, Dr. Joseph Farrell. I think that Dr. Joseph Farrell is a perfect example of somebody who had a lot of good theology and then started pushing a lot of ridiculous nonsense that planets are weapons, Giza Death Star. It doesn't make any sense. It's silly. So no, I don't believe any of that stuff. That's just silly. Now, there could be catastrophism, there could be weird stuff, but I just am not convinced by what comes out of these kinds of Gnostic presentations, Gnostic press books, etc. So what was the thing that really turned my attention away from the woo-woo stuff and into the reality realm? Well, at the same time as I was studying a lot of this in grad school, I was learning about the CIA, espionage, and how geopolitics is really about that kind of stuff. The real conspiracy world isn't so much aliens which is all like perfect vehicles for disinformation. The real conspiracy world is stuff like Russiagate, the concocting of stories and narratives and disinformation nonsense in the real geopolitical realm for verifiable purposes. And I started realizing, well, the alien stuff does the same thing. It furthers a technocratic agenda. You realize that Klaus, World Economic Forum, all of those people push the alien stuff. And then the same thing is going on with the realm of conspiracies, much of which is disinformation. So yeah, I've watched Fabled Enemies and I watched Loose Change and Alex's documentaries, and those are all great. But you start to realize, well, who is this deep state? What is this deep state? What is really going on with this entrenched national security state domain that seems to be behind a lot of things like international banking scams, organized crime, Operation Gladio, Paperclip, all that stuff seems to keep pointing back to this kind of stuff, not Men in Black and all this gay alien stuff, but actual operations that you can read about in the history of the CIA, the history of the OSS, the history of World War II espionage, the Cold War. All of that stuff kept pointing in the direction of the real conspiracies are bankers and spies, not aliens, ancient alien technologies, and all this bullshit. And not reptilians from the Zeta Reticulan dimension or whatever. But British intelligence, the CIA, the Mossad, those are the books that are the real conspiracy books. The history of those things. This was a big turning point in what I found to be real conspiracies and not all of this sci-fi Star Trek crap. And I learned that, I've started figuring that out in my 20s, right? And again, I think part of the reason I came to that conclusion was in studying and writing about Hollywood and studying underneath professors who had researched the history of CIA operations in Latin South America. That same professor, who was a super lib, by the way, that same professor did a class on Oliver Stone and history. It was one of my favorite college classes. And what we were doing in that class was saying, okay, here's Oliver Stone's presentation. What is the closest that we could come to in terms of historical accuracy and compare that to what Oliver Stone was putting in his films? And although I don't agree with everything that Oliver Stone believes, a lot of what he was putting in the films was more accurate, for example, than what was the mainline news narrative of that time. And that doesn't mean I support, Bishop, whatever, that was the James Wood movie. Even though it's a pretty good film, I'm not pro-liberation theology or anything like that. But I think when Oliver Stone was intending to present these sorts of stories, nobody knew the degree to which there was Israeli involvement in the JFK event, etc. I don't think that he was intentionally putting out disinformation. I think he was working with what he had at the time. And so if you look at the tendency in American politics to criticize, for example, Israeli foreign policy and involvement in America, throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that was largely the left. It didn't start to become a right-wing criticism until the last, say, 10 years. Now, prior to the 60s or the 70s, 80s, and 90s, criticism of that kind of stuff was, there were right-wing thinkers, Father Coughlin, other people who criticized Israeli or Jewish involvement in American politics back in the 40s, 50s, etc. But that got shut down very quickly by a lot of the World War II era propaganda and the films that were coming out from Hollywood in the 1940s, which we've been talking about recently. A lot of the Humphrey Bogart films, a lot of the John Ford stuff, a lot of the Joan Crawford films, they were all kind of targeted, pretty obvious Allied propaganda films. That doesn't mean I'm saying Tiny Mustache Man is good. I'm just giving you the real history, which is, again, not black and white. It's nuanced. Yeah, I mean, for example, Oliver Stone's Wall Street, right? Essentially, Gordon Gekko operates like a CIA handler, right? In fact, he even tells Bud Fox that I want you to get dirt on people and get inside information. That's how you actually, game the stock market. It's not who has the best trading practices and who's the smartest. And so Gordon Gekko is basically a kind of a Wall Street CIA operative. So I could understand that critique and understand the flaws of Wall Street and what Oliver Stone is saying without at the same time saying, oh, well, I guess communism and socialism is good. You see, everybody functions, especially boomers, on this very narrow either or framework. And all of us, I think, especially when you're young, you're much more susceptible to these very simplistic either or dialectics, right? So thinking that geopolitics, or figuring out that geopolitics and espionage is the real conspiracy was a big part of waking up out of um, my overly conspiratorial slumbers. Is that, if that makes sense? Because then you start to realize, like, well, actually, all of the world's embassies, everybody has embassies, and everybody knows that spies are at embassies. And this is just acceptable nation state practice that people are engaging in espionage. So I think when you first, learn about this stuff, you kind of have a schizo paranoia phase where you're like, oh, there's spies everywhere. Everybody's a spy. Everybody's an operative. Everybody in media works for the CIA. It's not like that. There is an understood expectation of nation to nation, power block to power block espionage. I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying that that's the real world. That's how the world works. So understanding more of history, understanding the big picture, understanding civilizational studies was a level and a step beyond the very simplistic disinformation that is everywhere in the conspiracy realm. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying that there's no conspiracies. I'm saying that the world of conspiracy literature online, which you could go back to, the JFK era kind of kicks it off, people questioning it, the CIA demonizing people that question the event, calling them conspiracy theorists. This eventually in the 80s and 90s gives birth to PatCon, or the Patriot Conspiracy, where the feds are kind of infiltrating, right-wing militia groups and these kind of simplistic Bible Belt sort of prepper groups. And then what happens is we got this Ron Paul phase, right? So I would say from, 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, as Alex Jones and Ron Paul begin to have some popularity, begin to have some nationwide notoriety, calling attention to things that were very real, like the Federal Reserve being a giant scam. So Ron Paul did a good job in calling attention on a large scale to real conspiracies like the Federal Reserve. Now, Ron Paul, I think, had a lot of not so good ideas and ideologies, and I don't think that libertarianism is a real answer, but at least in calling attention to the Federal Reserve, he did a lot of positive in the history of American politics. Unfortunately, though, it was still kind of wrapped up in that very limited, very negative liberty scope that libertarianism has, whereas it's not a real solution, even though it has some good critiques. Just telling everybody, privatize everything and let me have my liberties, bro, it's not good enough. It doesn't do anything. There's no world power that was actually libertarian, except for perhaps America for a little while. And so people who then continue the outdated, limited answers of libertarianism, whether it's a Ron Paul figure or whether it's a James Lindsay or a Tim Pool, I mean, they might have good critiques at points here and there, but the answers and the solutions are just not enough. They're not good enough. Just my GDP and let me have my business and let me have my stash of gold. Like, well, we need to audit the Fed and stack some gold, like Ron Paul says. I mean, it's just not enough. People actually want worldviews, and they want a religious perspective that makes sense of why we should be libertarian or why we should have rights or duties, you see. So just more enlightenment liberalism is not enough. And that's why ultimately Dr. Jordan Peterson never got out of, maybe he will, never got out of the controlled classical liberal dialectic. This has been my same critique of him for almost 10 years. You're not going to stop the onslaught of trans and Antifa and all this insanity, BLM, with more liberalism, more civic nationalism. Ooh. It doesn't work. It's emasculated and ineffectual. And so I had to grow out of that libertarianish phase that I had in my 20s. I think many of us have had this phase. And a couple things that I read that really shook me out of this. One of them was actually a Tradcat book that I would still recommend. Obviously, Yaki's Imperium is a massive critique of liberalism, of course. But before I read this gigantic 700-page book, I read a very obscure Roman Catholic. And her name is Solange Hertz. And she wrote a book that I read when I was in the SSPX. And this is actually a really good book. It's called The Star-Spangled Heresy of Americanism. Now, again, everybody knows here, I am not a papist. I'm probably the internet's number one anti-papist. But Solange Hertz wrote a great book critiquing the idea of classical liberalism in the American experiment, the dialectic of enlightenment experiment that is Americanism. And again, while she was a traditional Roman Catholic, I don't think there's anything in this book except for, like, she cites papal encyclicals and that kind of stuff. Like, she had a really great critique here. So it was actually amongst the Tradcats that I really started reading and questioning my classical liberal libertarian ideas that I think most of us as Americanists, we just kind of, we swim in this voice. I mean, we swim in this water, whether this is the air we breathe. So we just sort of default to thinking that, well, yeah, classical liberalism is like the answer to all of this. We just need more America, more freedoms. But people are now becoming, I think, either really, really dumb or more sophisticated out in the public discourse. And they're starting to figure out that there's no such thing as just more freedoms, right? How many times have we had debates over the last 10 years with libertarians? And by the way, we kicked off our public debating career with debating Adam Kokesh, the 10-year ago famous libertarian. Now nobody even knows who Adam Kokesh is. He's totally forgotten. Dinosaur in terms of media voices. And I don't say that out of any like negativity. I don't hate the guy or dislike the guy. Adam's always been very nice on like a one-to-one level. He sent me his books and stuff. But it's just, if you go back to that debate, he just never got the point in that debate, which is that classical liberalism is dead. It's it's a come and gone philosophy. And the classical liberals are kind of in the same mindset as me in my 20s. It's this idealistic thing of like, well, if we just bring back more America, right? And this would be my main critique even of Alex Jones. I mean, I love Alex Jones. He's a great guy, always been very positive. But the one critique that I would have of Alex, I mean, obviously I would like to see him to become Orthodox, but politically, this classical liberal stuff is just not going to do anything. It's not the answer. 1776 is kind of the earlier version of 1984 because it's still in the Masonic revolutionary ethos. And I didn't really get any of that until I read this. And then there was another book that I read as a Tradcat. I think it's a book put out by the SSPX. What was it called? I want to say there was an SSPX book that came out. I'm talking about in like 2005, right? So I'm reading SSPX literature in 2004 or 5. And I want to say there was some book that came out about monarchy, but I can't remember the name of it. And I don't even remember who wrote it. I still have all these old SSPX books, but they're at the other place and they're like on an old shelf. I haven't thought about these books in like 15 years. So, but they did make an impact on me. Because there were quite a few Roman Catholic traditionalist writers, throughout the 1700s, 1800s that were writing critiques of revolutionary philosophy that are still pretty good. And we would probably agree with a lot of that stuff. So I never really went back to classical liberalism after understanding my critiques of the Enlightenment, not just from a Tradcat perspective, but also in Orthodoxy. And even when I wasn't Orthodox and I wasn't convinced of Catholicism anymore, I mean, I didn't become like a classical liberal. I mean, I might have still thought, well, There's some good points in classical liberalism, like we want to have, economic exchange and freedom to some degree. We want to have, some degree of liberty, but what the parameters of that are and how society should be structured is just not going to be solved by the Enlightenment ideas of like negative liberty. And negative liberty is not a Christian position historically. Negative liberty is the idea that of the atheistic writers of the French Revolution and of the Enlightenment, that the state has no role other than to be a minimal tool for economic exchange. That's it. But in the traditional Christian belief, the Christian monarch has a role to promote, to a degree, the virtues and to punish the vices. Now, that doesn't mean a big brother state where the king stares into your bedroom to see if you're jerking off or having dirty thoughts. We're not talking about big brother. We're not talking about the state having a role to promote all virtues and to punish all vices, because amongst vices, there's a difference between vices that are crimes and vices that are not crimes. Okay, so there would be a distinction between what's criminal versus just something that's merely a vice. For example, the state couldn't have penalties for dirty thoughts. Okay, that would be impossible. It would be insane. It would be some kind of weird 1984 scenario, right? But the state could conceivably have, obviously, penalties for public displays of nudity. I mean, I think that's still on the books in most places. You could have the banning of PDF, the banning of, sodomy publicly, that kind of stuff. Granted, there's no way to prove what everybody's doing in their bedrooms. So having a Christian state or a Christian monarchy does not equate to 1984. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Because I already know when I say this kind of stuff, wait a minute, if the state has a duty to punish the vices and to promote virtue, that's Big Brother. You're going to be in our bedrooms. No. Do you think that monarchies in the history of the West were spying in people's bedrooms? I mean, it's just kind of crazy. It's not even remotely close to history. In fact, many of these Western monarchs permitted whorehouses, and we saw both St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas argued for the legitimacy of the state allowing houses of ill repute. I'm not even sure I'm convinced of that. So, I mean, I guess, and libertarians will, by the way, will point to that stuff to point out the libertarian ethos of the West or whatever. I think this is a great point too. And by the way, that was another thing that I realized that was a problem in tradcatism, was you have this hyper rigidity about sexuality and sexual morals, and everything's a mortal sin and everything should be punished with these crazy tradcats. And then the top tradcats argue that the state should allow whorehouses. I was like, this is just insane. I mean, to me, that's just crazy. Like, these people, there's something off in this world of trad cats. By the way, a lot of the trad cats that I knew back then have since come out as Skittles. Shocker. That's why when that guy put that thing up that he was at the SSPX mass and he looked on Grindr, and like 3 of the dudes were sitting in the pew next to him on Grindr. So yes, trad cat is full of gay. Shocker. Moving on. I was, as you guys know, Protestant and Roman Catholic. So I was a Calvinist and I was a Catholic. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but those were huge mistakes because I had zeal without knowledge. And even though I read like crazy, and I read all the time because I didn't want to be wrong about my theology, I had absolute perfect spurgitude when it came to trying to perfect my theology. And I learned as I got older that actually reading all the right books and figuring all this stuff out is a futile quest. And that might sound paradoxical because, of course, I do like theology and I do enjoy intellectual pursuits, but I kind of realized at the end of my 20s that I'll never read all the books. I will never find all the information. I will never get all of the archives. I will never learn all the languages to go study in the catacombs in the Vatican Library to figure it all out. Like, it's not possible. Your life and your time is limited. So I realized that although providentially, I guess it worked out that I had many, many, many years of reading hundreds and hundreds of books, it kind of showed me the futility of many, 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 many books. And that's why Solomon says, to the making and writing of books, there is no end. It's a futile thing. So what's the point of all that? That books don't matter? No. I just had them in the wrong priority. And that brings me to the next one, which is that obsessing over books was wrong. Having the right Amazon list, wish list of reading list is not going to get you in heaven. Now, I didn't think that having the books would get you in heaven, but I did think that having the perfect theology was absolutely essential. And that eventually led to a dead end. And it was just like, okay, Rome is not it. What do I do? And I had some bad experiences back in 2007 at some Orthodox churches. And I was just like, I don't know. So I was in just sort of this amorphous, unknown state. I was not an atheist. I was kind of interested in Neoplatonism and perennialism or traditionalism to a degree, but I wasn't like into some school of like, oh, I'm going to go study under Friedrich Schumann's cult. I mean, it wasn't like that. Just buying books and trying to figure it out. So the next point is that everything was lopsided in what I should have been doing. So the books aren't the problem. The information isn't the problem. In fact, throughout my 20s and 30s, most of the time, I didn't spend any time on the internet. I avoided the internet because I thought the internet was a big problem. I was pretty much right. And I always focused on reading books. I didn't start doing internet stuff until about 2011. I mean, consistently doing a lot of internet stuff. Prior to 2011, I would only read books and avoided the internet. And so I had wrong priorities because I was still obsessed with figuring everything out. So I wanted to read all the right geopolitical books, all the right CIA history books, all the right espionage books, all the right philosophy books, all the right whatevers, all the right church fathers books. And I spent so much time doing that. And it just ended up with kind of nothing. And I was broke, still working a wage cut job. I had a massive library. Even I was, like in my 30s still, I think, working at a paint store. I was a manager of a paint store, but it was like, I wasn't getting anywhere. I mean, I was going to college, getting an undergrad and all that. I thought, well, I'll just try to teach. But point being is like, I realized the futility of putting all of my time, effort, and energy into books. And it's not the books that were the problem. It was the imbalance in me that was the problem. I should have been focused on furthering my own situation in terms of getting established, getting a career, et cetera, whatever. I mean, not that you have to go into careerism, but I'll give you an example. So in 2007 or 8, when I was going to be married to a girl prior to Jamie, and I was going through the catechumenate, right? And I was very interested in Orthodoxy, going to convert to Orthodoxy. But I had a couple vices that were a serious problem for where I was going. For one, I put the theology and the ideas first, even though I was dating for 4 years a girl that I intended to marry, but I was not fair to her by putting my ideas and my theology above everything else. And I really struggled with this. I don't think, maliciously trying to be unfair, but I remember at one point she said to me something like, if you're going to marry me, then marriage and a family should come before the theology and the ideas. And she kind of had a point, right? Because we had been dating for 4 years and we had the intention of getting married. And I was still iffy about it because I was like, well, I need to go to grad school and I need to, get the PhD. And then maybe then I can, provide for family or whatever. And she was like, well, I'm ready to have kids now and we should get married now. And now providentially, it all worked out to where it was not the right thing to do. If I had married her, I would have been a bad husband. I would not have been able to provide and to do the things that she actually had a really good critique about. So she was actually correct, but in God's providence, thank God we didn't get married, because it would have been a disaster. It was not a good thing. And for her, it was a better situation because she ended up marrying a guy who was a priest. And I'm sure she's much happier, and she's got a full quiver. She's got kids and she's doing fine. And it worked out way better for me to give me time to actually mature and figure out I'm not actually made for the mainline academia route. So you see how that would have been a disaster. So it was actually better for me to not have gone into that, to not convert to Orthodoxy at that time, to wait, to take some time, and providentially come back around to it when I was ready for that. I wasn't ready for that in my 20s, age 20. I forget, I was like 28 or something like that. So one thing I would say to my younger self that was a mistake is that when I was younger, obsessed with the theology and figuring it out and making it all perfect, I also felt like it had to be done right now. Like it's got to be solved right now. And I had no concept of patience and thinking maybe it's going to take years to get in the right place. Maybe God providentially knows I'm not ready to do this stuff yet, and I need time to mature. And that's exactly what it was. And there's no solution to maturation that you can just conjure up. I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about tonight actually has to do with time frames. We're talking 5, 10, 15, 20-year time frames for some of us. And that's okay. It's okay if you're not immediately convinced of orthodoxy. It's okay if you say, hey, wait, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. That's why we always encourage people to take their time. And when I was in my 20s and it was 2007 and I was like, I need to figure this out right now, I was not ready. I needed time. So don't beat yourself up and freak out and act spurgy in your 20s because you haven't figured everything out yet. It's not a big deal. It's okay. Like, take your time. And everybody's so like attacked by this toxic culture that now it's even worse, right? So it took me to age mid-30s to grow up. It's going to probably take the next generation like into their 40s to grow up. So getting a longer time frame and learning patience was something that I really needed to learn in my 20s, and to not be so obsessed over the things happening in the Middle East. I mean, again, I told you guys, like I got into the Middle Eastern stuff in 2007, around that same time, right? I started reading critiques of neocons, American foreign policy. I read all the anti-Zionist, anti-Talmudic, anti-Jewish stuff in the 2000s. And what I figured out was I'm not going to be able to solve this question. I don't even have enough. I live check to check. What am I doing worried about what's happening 2,000 miles away in the middle, 4,000 miles away in the Middle East? And I haven't, like, I'm struggling check to check. My priorities are out of whack. That's what I'm trying to say. And a lot of people on the internet, a lot of activists, it's the same irrational, immature, silly mistake. It's like you're sounding out on the internet. You're doing activism. Okay, that's great, but like, did you pay your rent? Do you have a savings? And obviously, I don't believe in fiat, but I mean, do you have some Bitcoin? Like, what are you doing that shows and demonstrates that you're actually a mature, capable man versus bitching all day on the internet? And even though I limited my time on the internet, I still bitched and whined a lot on the internet. For example, in the 2000s, when everybody was on Facebook, I remember many, many, many nights drunk debating on Facebook. I mean, I don't mean like sloppy falling down drunk. I just mean so much wasted time drinking beer and arguing on Facebook in my 20s. And I'm like, what the heck was I doing? What a complete waste of time. And as you get older, you're going to look back and be like, dude, I wasted so much time in my 20s. It was so, why was I doing that? That's another huge mistake. Drinking and wasting time in my 20s. Massive, stupid mistake. The sooner that you don't do that, the better you will be off. I trust you. So, looking for perfect theology when it came to Calvinism and the systems of Aquinas, John Calvin, and the papacy, right? I was sort of looking for these perfect systems, and I went from one to the other, from Calvinism to Thomism, thinking I found it. This is the perfect. No, this is the perfect system. And again, it's not that systems aren't how things work, but I had a overly high expectation as a 28-year-old guy or whatever for thinking that the systems are the answer. And is it Calvin? Is it Thomas Aquinas? Oh, wait, maybe it's this other thing, right? And then you realize, okay, none of these systems are going to be perfect. And the systems were actually kind of an idol. And if you told me that in my 20s, there's no way I was going to, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. But then it dawned on me, actually, Thomism is an idol. Calvinism is an idol. The systems are not Christianity. They have elements of it, and they're trying to systematize it. And I still think in terms of worldviews, paradigms, and systems. But I don't have the same unrealistic, immature expectation for systems like I did in my 20s. So when I see people like Wagner and I see Redeem Zoomer, like I see myself in my 20s. And hopefully as they get older, I think they will also come to some of the same realizations that I did when they get into their 30s and their 40s. Doesn't mean that you can't do systems analysis and systems thinking. In fact, we still criticize the Roman Catholics for not understanding and getting the point that if Roman Catholicism is defeated at a systemic level, then it's a system defeater. The system isn't true. And there's no amount of patchwork that you can do if the system itself at a systemic level is flawed. Last couple points. So that one is more so about the practical, that I didn't put establishing myself for a family and that kind of stuff. And I was so obsessed with all the ideas. And I've told you guys, like my dad would say stuff back then. Like I try to argue with my dad about geopolitics because it's like, oh, he was in the Navy and he knows about Operation Mantis. He was in Operation Mantis in the Gulf War and all this. And we've talked about this. And I'd be like, well, yeah, but you don't understand. The neocons are all wrong because of blah, 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 blah. And even though I was right in what I was saying to my dad about why the neocons were wrong, my dad would just say stuff like, do you have any assets? Have you got anything in your savings? Do you have any property? Are you sure that you're going to pay your rent next week? And that would make me really mad. But my dad was right. And as you get older, you realize, oh, my dad wasn't just being mean. And I used to say what all the people say to me. Me. I said the same stuff about my dad. Oh, my dad's just mean. I can't believe you said. Even though I was geopolitically correct, the neocons are a bunch of fraud losers. My dad's point was rather way more practical. You're yapping about all of this stuff in the Middle East 30, 50, 100 years ago. Are you going to be able to pay your rent next week? And that stung. But my dad was right. And I was wrong. But I was too immature and childish and out of whack to realize that. And a lot of you guys that are in your 20s that hate me now, as you get older in your 30s, you're going to realize that I'm right, what I'm saying to you. And it's not because I'm mean or I hate you or something like that. It's none of that. My dad doesn't hate me. My dad is a gruff military guy. But I look back and I realize he was right. I was wrong. I was the one that was immature. Yeah, I'm not talking about the Jordan Peterson clean your room stuff. Like I don't even know what that I don't even know what you guys are talking about. I'm just talking about like basic living practices and figuring out how to navigate in the world. A lot of the stuff that people think boomers are crazy about or ridiculous about, and boomers were and are way too focused on the practical. So I still think they are obsessed over stuff like just making money or something. But there is a point to some of it, right? If you've never run a business, how are you going to tell the world how money should work? Just think about that. I remember when I was in grad classes and we were talking about economics one day, and I remember leaving one of my grad classes and going and listening to Peter Schiff on a podcast. And he made a really good point, and I totally disagree with his gold boomer nonsense, right? But Peter Schiff made a really good point, which was when you go to college, you hear all these economics professors that have all these highfalutin ideas about stats and how the economy should work. And he's like, but these professors have never run a business. Why would you think that a person who's never run a business knows how the economy should work? And I remember thinking, man, that's actually, I never thought about that. Real world practical insight and wisdom is way more accurate than idealistic leftist idiot college professor socialists who tell you all day long about how it should work and how it ought to be. Totally divorced from the real world. And so again, Peter Schiff was actually right. And that massively changed my paradigm when it came to, wait a minute, these professors don't know anything. I mean, they know what's in some of the books, but, and I remember talking to Sammy the Bull, right? And he said something like this, like, as a mafia guy, I have a better insight into how the world actually works than the professors. And I was like, actually, that's pretty much true. There's a funny scene in the Rodney Dangerfield movie too, where this comes up. Back to school. So there's this know-it-all college professor who's like talking about all these economic theories. And Rodney Dangerfield goes back to college, right? It's still kind of a funny 80s movie. And he's just sitting in the the class, like in the back row, and he's listening to the professor tell all these theories, and then he's like, who's going to grease the skids, right? He's like coming up with all this basic practical stuff about how you actually run a business. So that's actually a pretty funny scene that exemplifies what I'm saying. If you never watched Back to School, watch it. It's pretty funny, but for 80s movies. So I'm not going to theologically go into the papacy or Calvinism or whatever. We've done that a million times. You guys can go watch all those critiques. But I think personally, part of the motivation for why I looked at and believed those systems for certain years in my life was because I thought, well, there is this perfect system somewhere that actually categorizes and explains everything. And when those systems would have very fundamental problems in them, Calvinism and Thomism, then I would kind of be put into a quandary and my worldview would collapse. So then I didn't know what to do, and I would have to, it's kind of the way Jordan Peterson describes it, right? Where you kind of have like a death of yourself for a time period, right? Your worldview collapses, and it's a difficult experience, but it's also a good experience because it allows you to grow and become a better person. And it is kind of like a little death, so to speak, when you go through these paradigm level collapses in your paradigm. So lastly, again, to this point of like, yeah, I was looking into different ideas, and I was, well, maybe the Neoplatonists and this and that, and maybe this system and that system. And then I realized, okay, there's not a perfect idealized system. And maybe the system building is itself the problem. And maybe books and geopolitics and political movements aren't ultimately going to save us, and that's not the ultimate answer. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy those things, but in all of these things that we've listed and talked about, I realized my priorities are out of whack. That was the main problem here, was I was putting all of these other dumb things first as if I was going to solve the world's problems. And then my own life has pretty significant flaws and problems. And I still have many problems, sure. But when it comes to writing my own books, running a business, etc., like those problems I have solved, right? Becoming economically stable, paying my bills, those problems are solved. But I should have focused on figuring out how to solve those problems way earlier than trying to figure out all the world's problems. Does that make sense?